How we doing, coin traders? Thanks for joining me for the show looking at Bitcoin Cash, BCH on that ticker. Like a lot of the rest of crypto, not a whole lot happening ever since we have had the halving for Bitcoin Cash. And obviously it's been a little bit more of a fun excitement and a little bit more momentum to the upside as compared to what we saw for Bitcoin Core. But obviously a big retracement here for Bitcoin Cash after that fact. So we're looking at a pullback right now, come on, of about down to the low 45% to the current price 35%. So not necessarily that bad, and doing a little bit better on some of the longer term charts in terms of supports and the trend here. So I want to first dive over on into the 4-day chart. Don't talk about 4-day all too often, but right now in this instance, very relevant and applicable specifically because we have been looking ever since basically the summer of last year of finally flipping this trend bullish and maintaining a nice upside trend and momentum ever since then. So for basically about a year now, we have been sitting in this very nice position compared to a lot of the rest of the cryptos. Haven't seen this type of trend set up for this long. So definitely a good sign and setup. And that's why it is important right now to actually be aware of what's coming up and happening. So kind of a very similar pattern what we saw after this compared to what we saw back in the summer of last year. Pullback, retracing to the exponential moving averages, but still maintaining these as a very nice longer term guide. So we did have a period from the low here down to basically the next breakout of over 180 days. So about 6 months here. Not necessarily that much happening, so only about a 40% gain. Don't necessarily think that's going to be the case in the current setup since we are in different sort of cycle, different part of the cycle, and also different market conditions compared to that. But one of the big things that we actually have happening right now for Bitcoin Cash is that we have a complete sell-off a complete taper off in selling pressure. So basically to still see more or less sideways action maintaining 12-period exponential moving average, 26-period exponential moving average on this 4-day chart. Yet meanwhile, we do have the volume down here starting to taper off. So very good sign that we're starting to hold as well as selling pressure decreasing. Does mean that the likelihood of a pullback is going to be a lot lower now, since typically when we do find selling pressure decreasing and we also find prices stabilizing, it's going to take a lot actually to push prices down. So without an increase in bearish selling pressure volume, we know that that's not likely to happen at all. So pretty much we can assume we're kind of going to get another one of these repeat type patterns where we might not necessarily see that much trading action, but we're not going to see prices start to pull back and test the downside. But now do need to zoom out here and actually look at previous price trading action, because if we actually look back to the left here, January 2021, this is when we did find our heartline for a lot of this movement, did find a lot of support, heartline for this pullback, as well as big points of support and resistance. So all of that kind of mirrors with what we're finding right now, which is why we like these sideways consolidation zones, because once we actually do blow above it, it's going to be pretty hard to actually pull back and break through this big zone of support here. And a lot of this is apparent when we actually look at the VPVR, volume profile visible range. So as you can see, we're currently sitting on a pretty big point of mass right now. And typically, once we do find a little bit more upside action, it will be a little bit easier to actually see this big taper off in massive volume, which does allow price to usually extend higher to the upside. That's kind of why we end up getting these big spikes, because it doesn't take that much volume to actually push. And despite having a lot of volume down here on time, we know that there's not a lot of time sitting at a level which doesn't allow it to be confirmed as that support or resistance. So when we do have a lot of volume at certain level, that's pretty much why we actually focus on this so much, as being a very relevant guide for where we can find price action being, just because we know historically it has come in at this level. And so when we do sit sideways at this price, especially like we said, tapering off in decreasing selling pressure, obviously we do have a little bit of selling off or tapering off in a bullish buying pressure as well, but that's not necessarily as bad because we're looking at slippage to the downside, not necessarily price action to the upside. So the longer we actually do take, that will be better in favor of the bulls to have that very nice breakout and look at prices pushing up a lot higher. So do have plenty of resistances overhead though. Like we said, we are looking just over the $500 psychological level at 506.58. Pretty much on top of that, we're going to be looking at about 530 level, which is going to be our price level resistance. So we do have a pretty big zone here that we're going to have to see. And then obviously looking over on VPVR, not as much as the current level, but still have a pretty decent amount for that as well. So we would ideally love to see a little bit more bullish volume come in. But as long as it's not strong bearish volume, we would still be looking good for the longer term. But otherwise, an inactive sideways chart is still pretty good for longer term growth. So like we said, looking very nice in terms of the setup for these exponential moving averages. And one of the things that we have seen now that we actually didn't see in previous market cycles is just the amount of reliance in confirming these as an uptrend guide. So if we actually look at the previous cycle, you can see coming off of the March COVID lows, actually sat sideways for quite a bit and then finally found a little bit of momentum to have a pretty quick rally, but otherwise mostly non-eventful. So essentially, if we're looking at this as a 4-year cycle, we would be about in this point as well, stabilizing. And so pretty much wouldn't look at a lot of the upside momentum happening until November. But in the current setup right now, we're looking at a very nice uptrend still being in effect. So we could see this actually start to play out and start to have a little bit more of that run compared to this extremely short spurt that we saw back in the 2020 and 2021 cycle. Now, so want to flip over to the monthly chart. Don't typically talk too much about monthly charts all that often, but one of the things, like we said, especially comparing it to the previous rally, or the previous cycle rather, is just how we're doing on these 26 and 12 period EMAs, where we were initially finding a lot of resistance, especially coming off the spring and COVID lows here, where we did just go sideways, find a lot of resistance on the 12 period exponential moving average. Compare that to what we found now. We actually had big rally pullback, find a lot of support on this 12, finally confirm it, kick off, and then now we're well above the 12, 26, and 50 period EMAs. So even despite having a pretty big pullback month last month, we are still only about 2 days from closing the current monthly candle, and it is a little bit bullish, but obviously, as you can see, magnitude of the body is just not that much compared to the previous pullback month. But obviously, compared to the nice bullish month that we had back in March, very, very good sign still, especially since we haven't seen another second following a bearish month of pullback. But we do know that, especially because we're looking at forming a full bullish cross here before too long, we are getting our 12 on top of the 50, especially after we've already had 12 on top of 26. So the only thing we will be waiting on then is just the longer term 26 over the 50, which will confirm a fully bullish setup. And especially because it's happening so far earlier into the cycle compared to where we have seen previously, we know that this does end up typically rubbing off bullish for a lot of the longer term growth that we are expecting just because of where we are at right now in the cycle. So whereas if we were later in the cycle, kind of what we experienced last year or last cycle, excuse me, then that pretty much is our sign that once we actually do flip bullish, we can't actually run out that far. But because we've actually seen a nice bullish cross, we know that that's going to be a little bit more of that bullish momentum heading into the rest of the peak and euphoric parts of the cycle that does typically spin off a lot more upside bullish gains than what we have found in the previous cycle here. But like we said, not necessarily the most bullish candle, so it is still entirely possible that over the next month we could still see another retracement, backtesting these EMAs as that supportive level, as well as backtesting the previous levels that we're looking at for price resistance, which could be potentially all the way down to 310. Not necessarily that likely because especially from where we found the trend high at 717, right around there would be 56% pullback. A lot of altcoins have found pullbacks and retracements that much, but we're not necessarily expecting that across the board because likely that would mean the rest of crypto and altcoin would be pulling back substantially from there as well, especially considering that from current prices, we'd be looking at about a 33% pullback. So I don't necessarily think that that course of action right now, especially in the face of decreasing selling pressure, is the most likely. But obviously, we still have to be aware of that as a potential option, especially in setups like this, where we typically find once we do get bullish crosses, a backtest of these after they have been big resistance that has been confirmed as resistance. We always do need to backtest them and confirm them now as support. So eventually it will happen, but whether or not it does happen in the next couple of months or until we actually run up and allow the exponential moving averages to catch up before backtesting and being on our way again. That's obviously always a case that we typically see in nice euphoric bull markets, but we will end up seeing, of course. Now, I do want to drop down into the weekly chart here, and we could turn off the 50 period EMA and specifically just look at the 12 and 26. So if we do that, we are still holding very nice support like we've talked about before, especially after confirming this level as a big period of resistance. And so this is extremely nice because we know that right now, despite being on the cusp of looking right at the 12-period EMA on the weekly, we are still very much in this supportive state where we actually have a lot of zone left below us, and we could still see prices pull back to that level. But realistically, we think that we are going to be finding a very nice supportive level for the longer term, and so potentially could see prices testing the lower lows, 422, potentially all the way down to the low right now, about 400. And that is a very strong psychological level. Looking left, obviously pretty big point of support, and support didn't quite get there for resistance, but got stuck up in between the 12 and 26. So we know that we're likely right now between especially this big zone, as well as exponential moving averages, not necessarily expecting prices to get anywhere below that. But if we do look at current prices down to 400, we would be looking at a potential pullback and retracement up to about 14%. So not necessarily an impossible ask if we do think that we could actually see a pullback down to that level, but I wouldn't really expect prices to get too much lower than that if I had to guess right now, just based on how we have seen Reliance and confirming and backtesting these guides as very strong technical indicators for the current trend that we're looking at. Now, I want to pull up some technical indicators, specifically stochastic RSI here, because I do want to look at how we are below the 20 line right now, getting a little bit of this nice bullish cross. And if you can see, the last couple of times that we saw this stochastic RSI below the 20 line, had a nice bullish cross, and then finally got back above the 20 line, we had a very nice upside pump and move. So like we looked at previously, as well as this last time, crossed above the 20 line, and then saw this very nice candle break out, and then a very, very nice couple of months here with a lot of upside pressure direction, just like we saw in both of these instances. So what we are expecting right now is kind of a little bit more of the same if we do get that to play out, where we do have a nice bullish cross, and then assuming this does get back above the 20 line, that should be a very nice upside guide and direction to at least push prices back to the previous trend high that we're looking at least kind of right around up to the $700 level. But in this instance too, especially since we have back tested and confirmed support on the 12 and 26, we could still see a very nice potential move up to the previous trend high right now that we're looking at, which could end up leading to a new trend high. And that would be something that wouldn't be abnormal to see in this current setup. Now, we've talked about a decrease in the bearish selling pressure. And what's notable too is that this bullish week and this bullish candle that came in, pretty small in terms of magnitude of volume as well. So only 125.3 thousand compared to all the other previous weeks. So even this candle right here that we were looking at 139.3. So obviously more in terms of sell pressure. Yet if we actually look at the body, this body of bullish candle is actually pretty good shape, and especially because it engulfs the previous bearish week, especially when we were kind of right in line in terms of volume. So that bearish week, we're looking at 125.63. And like we mentioned, the bullish week was 125.3. So barely just over that in terms of volume. But if we do look at the actual candle itself, plenty of good things to be looking at, both the magnitude of the body of the candle, as well as minimal lower shadow, and also a minimal upper wick. So compared to the previous bearish week, we're looking at a pretty big upper wick, a little bit more of that selling pressure, which obviously we saw, and then from there reversing. So current setup right now, especially two bearish candles, about almost 4 days until we close the current weekly candle. But so still expectation right now, especially based off of how this upside candle for bulls did actually play out, we are still expecting a hold on top of this low for support, which like we said, does come in at 421. But the biggest thing is that we are looking at strong closing level of resistance overhead just over the 480 line. So especially because on this bullish candle, we didn't get any follow through. We started to, but obviously a lot of sell pressure is what put this big upper wick on that candle. And essentially now are seeing a little bit of follow through from the bears, pushing prices back down below. So if we can't get on top of that level, very good and strong cases to see a little bit more of a continued upside direction. Otherwise, pretty much we are just going to stabilize and consolidate probably in between this zone. And like we said, as long as we do stay pretty much on top of 420 and down to the $400 psychological level as well. Big points of supports But yeah, otherwise we are going to be looking at a very tight zone and range. So a lot of it's going to come down to what the rest of the crypto markets do and whether or not we can see a breakout. But nothing ahead on the horizon based on the chart setup right now for Bitcoin Cash. Shorter term, though, still have been working on changing the trend. So found our low of the move, our high, higher low, higher high. Now pulling back, trying to make sure we establish this higher low. And so especially be based on a volume down here, increasing nice bullish volume, tapering off in bearish volume. So should still see the bulls be able to hold a higher low, especially since that is all the way down to about the 425 level. So still expecting the bulls to be able to maintain that, because from current prices, that's still a 10% pullback. Not impossible for crypto, but like we said, based on how the last couple of weeks have been playing out, not expecting that much of a pullback and retracement to be able to break and start to change the trend back bearish in favor of that. So still not necessarily expecting a huge takeoff to the moon, but right now, still very nice setup right now, and knowing that probably we're not going to see any prices dropping down and seeing anything head lower unless we just get some crazy type of black swan event or a lot more bearish sentiment coming out for the crypto space. So yeah, sorry that crypto's not really more exciting right now and isn't really that much of a nice, explosive, euphoric state and sentiment level just yet, but we will eventually get there before too long. These are still very nice market setups, and hopefully does allow the nerves to be calm. And obviously, if you are looking to buy any sort of dip, these dips are the dips that you do enjoy buying, especially after 50 to 60% retracement for a lot of cryptos. But anyway, I digress. That is going to wrap it up for today. Make sure you let me know your questions, comments, issues, disagreements, all that down in the comment sections below. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please hit the thumbs up, like, and subscribe. As always, do appreciate all the continuous love and support as always. Does mean so much. Stay safe, take care, coin traders, and I will catch you back in the next video. Peace.